Welcome to the CCG Museum, where we research and preserve the history of old and defunct collectible card games to ensure their memory is preserved for future gamers. For today's tour, we're going to take a look at the brainchild of designer Luke Peterschmidt and artist Gerald Brom. This was a game with big plans that were cut short prematurely by unrelated events beyond its control. This is the story of Dark Age, Feudal Lords. The world of Dark Age takes hundreds of years in our future. It's a dark future that will feel quite familiar for enthusiasts of post-apocalyptic movies like Mad Max. The kind of movies where the world has become a blasted desert wasteland, the skeletons of once great cities providing questionable shelter at best. Technology has regressed to primitive, jury-rigged contraptions that can be cobbled together from whatever junk can be scavenged, although sometimes intact examples of incredible pre-apocalypse tech can be found. Governments disappeared long ago. All that remains are warring factions that vie for what little territory is still worth fighting for. In Dark Age Feudal Lords, you take the role of a gang leader, combating other gang leaders for that territory. To play the game, you start by choosing your leader card. This is your avatar in the game. Each leader has a different ability and slightly different stats to help them recruit and boss around characters. Next, you choose a controlled locations card. This represents the 3 locations under your control that you need to defend from your rivals. Next, you construct a deck, or stockpile, which must consist of a minimum of 55 cards, with no more than 4 copies of any single card. To set up the game, shuffle your deck, then cut your opponents. Remember, you may trust your opponent, but always cut the deck. Draw 10 cards, then choose and discard 2 of those cards for an initial hand of 8 cards. Roll your leader's resource dice, and then place 5+1 tokens next to your leader. Choose who will go first, and then the game has begun. First comes the stockpile phase. You may choose to discard up to 2 cards. If you do, you draw the same number of cards plus 1 more. Next is the draft phase, where you try to recruit characters into your gang. You spend 1 leadership to attempt the draft, and may spend more to sway the odds in your favor. Roll a die, make any necessary adjustments, then compare it to the character's control stat. If you rolled higher, they're working for you now. If not, then discard them and it sucks to be you. You will notice that some characters have little triangles around their name, and some do not. Those that do have the triangles are generic characters, and you may have multiples of these on the table at once. Those without the triangles are named characters, and there can be only one of them on the table at any given time. Not just in your gang, but on the table. If your opponent has a named character in their gang, you cannot draft that same character into yours. But if that named character is killed or otherwise removed from play, then you may attempt to draft them. Basically, named characters have plot armor and never really die. Generic characters are dime a dozen mooks that nobody really cares about. Next is the action phase. This is the real meat of the game. You can play resource cards, equip your characters with skills and/or equipment, and attack your opponent's locations. Resource cards have an effect but also grant you 1 victory point. However, they can only be played on locations that haven't been looted, and if that location becomes looted, the resource card is discarded, and you lose that victory point. Skills and equipment make your characters more awesome, though each character has a cap of how much of either they can use. Combat is what will make you decide if you love this game or hate it, and we will get to that shortly. These actions can be taken in any order. However, you may only initiate 1 combat per turn. The other actions may be performed multiple times, as long as you have the resources for them, but they may not be taken during combat. So if you need to equip someone with those grenades, do that before you send them on their mission. There aren't any Amazon delivery drones in the post-apocalypse. Though that would make an awesome artifact card now that I think about it. The 4th and final phase is the resource phase. If you have fewer cards in your hand than your leader's minimum hand size, you draw up to that number. Then you can choose whether or not to re-roll your resource dice, which is usually a good idea if you're running low, but you must roll both. So if you have 6 leadership still, but only 1 resource, you can either keep both as is, or re-roll both and keep the results. As a mercy rule, if you roll a 1 on your leadership die, you immediately draw a card. Your turn is now over. Returning to combat, As I said, this is where most people are either going to become intrigued or be turned off, because this is where the bulk of the dice rolling is, and there's a good amount of it. To attack, the player whose turn it is declares which opponent they are going to attack, which of their locations they are going to attack, and which characters they are attacking with. After the attacker has paid the required leadership cost for their attack pool, the defender declares if they will defend and which characters they will defend with, and then pays the required leadership. The defender can, of course, choose not to defend, but if they don't, then the attacker automatically loots the location they attack. Now, before we start rolling dice, you need to look at the three boxes at the bottom of the character cards. The oval box contains the character's distance fire 2-hit numbers. The square box contains the close combat 2-hit numbers, and the hexagon has the close combat defense numbers. When you roll for any of these, you roll 2 dice and you want to roll as high as possible. Each number in the box that you meet or exceed, you get 1 success. So for example, Initiated of the Merc has only 1 number in their distance fire box, so at most they can deal 1 point of damage in the distance fire round. But they have 3 numbers in the close combat box, so if they roll a 9, they deal 1 damage, but a 12 is 3 damage. The close combat defense box works the same except for preventing close combat damage. Normally, you cannot block any distance fire damage. Okay, let's finally get to fighting. Combat lasts either 3 rounds or until one group has been eliminated. The first round is the distance fire round. As the name implies, this is when the groups fire their ranged weapons at each other as they move into close combat range. Each of your characters picks a target in the other group and then rolls for distance fire. Damage is dealt simultaneously. If anyone takes damage equal to or greater than their health points, they're dead. If both groups still have living characters, advance to the first close combat round. In this round, characters are paired with each other. The attacker chooses the first pairing, the defender the next, and you go back and forth until no pairs can be made. If one side has more characters than the other, they get to add their excess characters to one of the matchups as support. Each character who has been paired up rolls close combat to hit, and then any character who has been assigned wounds gets to roll close combat defense to reduce the amount of damage they will take. Supporting characters also roll their close combat attack dice at this time, but can only deal 1 close combat damage no matter how high they roll. After applying wounds, if anybody dies, discard them. Again, if one side has been eliminated, combat is over. Otherwise, advance to the final round of combat. For the second round of close combat, if a character killed their opposing combatant, find them a new opponent. If there are no characters to pair them up with, you can add them as a supporting character to another pair. The round then proceeds exactly the same as the first close combat round. After all the dice have been rolled and everyone who died is discarded, combat ends. If the attacking group eliminated the defending group, they loot the location. If not, they return to their home base with their tails tucked between their legs. Losers. Both players claim any victory points they are entitled to from the combat, and the attacking player continues their turn. The game is over when, at the end of any turn, any player has 10 or more victory points. If 2 or more players all have more than 10 victory points and there is a tie, the game continues until a turn ends with one player having the most victory points. Congratulations! You are the undisputed ruler over this corner of blighted wasteland. For now. Please keep in mind, this was a brief explanation of how to play the game. I did skip over a few things, so if you want to play Dark Age yourself, make sure to read the rule book. Inside it, you will also find rules for games with more than 3 players and a variant for solitaire play. So how is Dark Age Feudal Lords as a game? The answer to that question mostly boils down to if you like the combat or not. With all that dice rolling, it has a distinctly miniatures wargame feel to it. If you've ever been playing games like Necromunda, Mordheim, or Frostgrave, but thought to yourself, this game really needs more Magic the Gathering in it, then Dark Age is your dream come true. If you have a severe phobia of dice, then you'd best avoid Dark Age. If you're somewhere in between, I'd say give it a try. You might just find you enjoy skirmish games in your CCGs. Aside from the combat, it's really not all that different from most other CCGs of the era. You summon creatures, enhance them to make them better, attack, defend, use play anytime cards to surprise your opponents. The usual. The biggest difference is using dice on your leader as your resources instead of cards inside your deck. And while getting low rolls for multiple turns in a row can be very frustrating, is it really any more frustrating than pulling no resource cards when you desperately need them, Or too many resource cards when you need anything else at all? I would argue it's roughly the same amount of frustrating. I'd also like to highlight the draw system as being one of the best draw systems out there. Having a minimum hand size as opposed to a maximum hand size makes sure you'll never be without options, and the discard to draw method ensures that you'll be able to cycle through your deck at a healthy rate, letting you access the cards you need when you need them. So it's a great game for players, but what about collectors? Does Dark Age have anything for them? Well, I can answer that question in a single word. Duh. With only a single set released, aside from the chase cards and the 2 promotional cards, it's not too difficult to get a complete set. In addition to the relative ease of completion, just look at the art. I'm going to go more in depth about the art later, but this is gorgeous art, the likes of which you don't find in just any old CCG. Frankly, Dark Age is worth collecting for the art alone. There aren't very many games I would say that about, but Dark Age is at the top of that list. Do keep in mind that while it's not really difficult to find Dark Age cards, there is a fairly high demand for them, which keeps prices for unopened packs and boxes relatively high, so don't expect rock bottom prices. You probably won't have to spend an arm and a leg, but you might have to spend a finger and a few toes. For the connoisseur, there was also a French release of the game, though it seems to have been quite small compared to the English release. The entire set was released with the exception of the 2 promotional cards, but while I've seen plenty of loose cards for sale, I have yet to see any sealed French boosters or French starters for sale. So if you like collecting rarities, go ahead and look for the French cards. Dark Age was the brainchild of game designer Luc Peterschmidt and artist Gerald Brom, who is commonly referred to by just his last name. Luc Peterschmidt has been in the gaming industry for quite a while. Some of his early gaming work was at FPG, the Friedlander Publishing Group, where he helped design the Guardian CCG under Keith Parkinson before becoming the lead designer of Dark Age for the same company. He would later go on to work for Wizards of the Coast, Sabertooth Games, and Alderock Entertainment Group, just to name a few. He currently works as the head of studio at Asmodee North America. So this guy knows games. Brom started out doing commercial art for such corporations as Coca-Cola and CNN, but was able to escape to more fulfilling work at TSR, working on Dungeons & Dragons. They rather quickly gave him near complete freedom to create the visual style of the Dark Sun setting, one of the best decisions TSR ever made. After leaving TSR, he did work for all sorts of CCGs, RPGs, and other acronyms involving the word game. He's also done all sorts of work for movies, computer games, published art books, and even written a few novels. Quick word of advice though, never ask Brom about Dixie cups. If you've ever wondered what gives a man like Brom nightmares, the answer is Dixie cups, no joke. In the mid-90s, both Brom and Peterschmidt had been working on the Guardian CCG. If you know anything about that game, it's that Guardians arguably has the greatest art of any CCG ever. Decades later, and it's still unsurpassed. However, Guardian's art direction was cheery, whimsical even. It was bright and fun and not very serious. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this. This was art direction by fantasy art giant Keith Parkinson after all. But Brom, as amazing of an artist as he is known for art that is none of those things. Even the art Brom was making for Guardians mostly had to do with demons or the undead. Still, like a death metal junkie trapped at an AKB48 concert, Brom was hoping to escape someplace less saccharine. Fortunately for him, Luke was having similar thoughts. Guardians was all well and good, and quite successful, but it was also Keith Parkinson's baby. So Luke and Brom got together and began brainstorming. Over the next year or so, they hashed out the look, feel, and background of the game. Luke spearheaded building the rules, while Brom brought it to life with his artistic vision. In time, it all came together as the Dark Age we all know and love today. And the first set, Feudal Lords, was published by FPG, which had also published Guardians, a game we have plans to cover in the future. FPG was known mostly for art books and art trading cards, which would explain why they were able to find so many talented artists for their games so easily. Now, this leads me to point out that earlier, when I said that Guardians arguably had the best art of any CCG ever, you need to understand I didn't mean that in the ensuing 30 years another game has come along with art rivaling Guardians. No. I meant that in the ensuing 30 years, nothing has come along that can match it, except for Dark Age. Just look at this art. Seriously, look at your screen right now as I show you some of my favorite pieces. This is gorgeous art. While I admit there's some art I don't necessarily care for, I also admit that I'm merely talking about personal preference. I'd never say any of this art is bad. To the contrary, there is not a single piece of art in this game that is bad or even mediocre. Here, let me show you what I think are some of the worst pieces of art. As you can see, none of this is bad. All of the contributing artists are obviously very skilled, and Braum made sure that they had the feel of Dark Age down pat. I might be coming off as a bit fanboyish as I talk about this, but I mean, it's Braum. He's one of the greatest fantasy artists ever. He's right up there with Frank Frazetta and the aforementioned Keith Parkinson. Just look at this art. This man was inspired. And the people he brought onto the project were no slouches. I especially love the weapons. Apparently, Henry Higginbottom, which is one of the most British names I've ever heard, actually physically made these items so they would feel that much more real. Because they were real. I also love how Dark Age is able to juxtapose such a dark setting with a sense of humor that doesn't feel out of place. It's most noticeable in the names of many of the victory cards, but there's plenty to be found in the art and flavor text as well. Maybe I should make a separate video about just the art of Dark Age, because if I were to put all of my thoughts about each artist and the coherent vision that Braum was able to bring to this game, it would make this video prohibitively long. So I'm just going to close by restating that I love this art. Dark Age is easily in the top 3 CCGs with the best art of all time, and a solid contender for first. Now, having said all that, just because I love the art doesn't mean we can't poke a little fun at it. I mean, just look at these. It's the scope on this fully automatic pistol that makes it so great.
Greetings. Festo is programmed to please. Please assume the position.
These are perhaps the most obvious examples of the influence Guardians had on Dark Age. I love how at first you think this is a type of mask to protect you from chemicals, but the more you look at it, the more obvious it becomes that it's actually a mask that injects chemicals into you. 500 years and an apocalypse later, and we still haven't solved the epidemic of alligators in our sewer systems.
Jeez. I love the power glove. It's so bad.
I want to ask Higginbottom if he used pool balls simply because they made a cool visual, or if it's actually a subtle reference to the fact that the development of plastic explosives began when an inventor used celluloid to try and create an alternative to ivory for billiard balls. The balls, when struck against each other hard enough, actually exploded loud enough to make people nearby think a gun had gone off. This happened during cowboy times, and there were actually examples of entire saloons pulling their guns out thinking somebody had started shooting. So I guess in the next Mission Impossible movie, Ethan Hunt becomes a Cirque du Soleil acrobat?
Hello, let us begin by introducing ourselves. I am
Chris.
a dance,
Mal.
and we want to pump you up.
I love this one. This guy actually looks impressed that somebody shot him in the middle of his forehead tattoo. He's got an expression on his face like, hey, good job.
If you're going to learn to be true dodgeballers, then you've got to learn the 5 Ds of dodgeball. Dodge, duck, dip, dive, and dodge.
Wait, what kind of training does she do? Whoa, this only raises more questions I'm not sure I want the answers to.
I mean, whatever you do, Brother Fox, whatever you do, please, Brother Fox, please don't fling me in that property.
There's an errata saying that these are extra effective on Christmas. Don't look it up.
Well, it just so happens that your friend here is only mostly dead.
Hold on just a moment. I need to consult the hot to crazy chart real quick. I can't quite tell, so I'm going to ask all of you. Does Clergy Anne count as a sexy nun? Dark Age was a little different in its distribution in that there were no boxes dedicated only to starter decks. Instead, there were combo boxes of both starters and boosters. They came with 6 starter decks and 30 booster packs. There were, however, normal booster boxes. They came with 36 packs each. Booster packs were fairly normal with 14 cards to a pack. They cost just $2.79, which would be just over $5.50 after inflation. The starter decks contained 65 cards, the rulebook, and a cool sticker. Each starter cost $12.95, which would be a little over $25.60 adjusted for inflation. Oh, I almost forgot to mention, each starter deck also came with 4 dice, which is the minimum each player needs to play the game. This wouldn't be a problem except that it necessitated taller starter boxes in order to fit the dice in them. As you can imagine, this was kind of annoying, as you couldn't fit them into normal collectible card boxes the way you could with your other CCGs. You had options, but none of them were great. If you insisted on keeping the dice with your decks, this meant you kept them in a Dark Age starter box. You could find a larger box not meant for collectible cards to carry them in, which would also mean that it wouldn't fit on the same shelf as your other boxes, at least not easily. You could fit the Dark Age starters into card boxes in inefficient ways, which is ugly and will bother you to no end if you have even the slightest hint of OCD. There were other solutions if you didn't mind keeping the dice in a dice bag and keeping the rulebook stored away from your decks. For instance, if you were handy with crafts, you could simply cut your Dark Age boxes down to the right size. The most common solution, though, was to just put your Dark Age decks into non-Dark Age starter boxes. It was the mid-90s, you probably had extra starter boxes for Magic or Guardians lying around. None of these options were especially appealing, but we worked with what we had, you know? Luke and Brahm had big plans for Dark Age going forward. They were hard at work on the first Expandalone set, called The Brood. The Brood would have taken place on the same post-apocalyptic Earth, but instead of Mad Max-style warlords fighting for turf in the ruins of a city, using technology made from thrown-together junk, the Brood was centered around mad scientists called Controllers, their Igor-like servants, the Brooders, and their biological abominations called Purpose-Built Organisms, or PBOs for short. The PBOs could be decked out with normal weapons or genetic augmentations. Just watch out for unintended mutations. The Brood would run on the same core rules as Feudal Lords, so they would be compatible enough to play against each other, while still being different enough that their cards couldn't be intermixed. For instance, the Brood used 8-sided dice instead of 6-sided. Peter Schmidt likened it to different factions in a miniatures war game. In the same way that Space Marines, Orcs, and Tau are compatible in the sense that they all use the Warhammer 40k rules, they're still different armies that have unique rules, units, weapons, and strategies that other factions don't. The next expansion being planned would contain cards for both Feudal Lords and the Brood, as well as cards that could be put into decks for both games. This expansion would also introduce the ability to add certain cards from the Brood into Feudal Lords and vice versa. This meant that the Brood would have the same card backs as Feudal Lords. Mind you, the idea of this expansion wasn't to suddenly make the games fully compatible, just allow for some more deck-building options. After all, these games take place in the same world, so there's no reason there wouldn't be mercenaries or such that are willing to work for anyone. I mean, one of the factions in Feudal Lords is literally called the Mercenaries, and they are exactly what it says on the tin. Next, a second, never-named Expandalone set was still in the brainstorming phases. While they hadn't yet fixed the premise for this expansion, they had been leaning towards a sort of techno-mechanical theme taking place in a cyborg graveyard of sorts. Presumably a place one could find and repurpose the broken machines of the pre-apocalypse era. I imagine it's something akin to the enormous scrapyard from Alita Battle Angel. The basic gist of the premise was a purely mechanical counterpart to the Brood's purely biological focus, with Feudal Lords somewhere in the middle. Future expansions after that would either focus on one of the games specifically, or contain cards for all three at once. They also had plans to translate Dark Age into French and German, and given how many languages Guardians had been translated into, those would have been just the start. As I said earlier, I have confirmed that a small French release did happen, although I've also been told that it was a pretty bad translation. Several magazines in the United States had French language cards as promotional inserts, and those are the easiest ones to find. But it is also possible to find loose French language singles on eBay and such. However, I've yet to confirm the existence of any German language cards. I'm not saying that 100% they definitely don't exist, as no one I spoke to could remember if the German translation happened or not. However, given the dearth of evidence currently at my disposal, I have to conclude that it did not happen. If you have any evidence to the contrary, I would love to hear from you. In addition to all these planned expansions, they'd signed a deal to make a role-playing game that used the same stats and combat mechanics as the card game, enabling GMs and players to use cards from the CCG as a handy-dandy stat sheet, while giving CCG players expanded lore. please never let me use the phrase handy-dandy ever again. In addition to all that planned gaming content, there were also plans to release a CD-ROM all about Dark Age that had art, screensavers, and a behind-the-scenes look at the production of the game. It was called the CD-BROM. Those are Luke's words, not mine. The future of Dark Age was looking bright. At least, it should have been looking bright. Dark Age was released in July of 1996, which was the tail end of the CCG glut. There were still far too many other CCGs clogging up shelves, and even though Guardians was a huge seller for FPG, Dark Age wasn't able to ride its coattails to the same success. That's not to say it sold poorly. It was making money, to be sure, and it was reviewing well in the magazines. But in such an overcrowded market, which at the time was really more of a bursting bubble than anything else, a CCG that played like a minis game was a bit of a radical departure from the norm, and apparently not everyone was willing to give it a fair shake. Not with so many other games out there that had more familiar gameplay or a well-established IP behind it. Dark Age was suddenly standing on shaky ground. They were still planning to release the Brood Expandalone in December of '96, and they were still working on expanding the reach into the European market. It looked like FPG was in it for the long haul with Dark Age. If only it hadn't been for the fact that at the time FPG was... how do I put this delicately? FPG was screwed. Far more was going on behind the scenes than I could possibly cover in this video, but long story short, FPG declared bankruptcy and dropped all projects they were working on. Everything. Heartbreakingly, when it happened, Dark Age the Brood was incredibly near completion. The card text was finished, the card layouts were done, some of the artwork had been submitted, and they were just waiting to receive the rest of the artwork so they could slap it on the cards, make them photo ready, and send it all to the printers. Alas, they received stand-down orders instead. Even sadder is that, despite the fact that Brom owns the rights to Dark Age as a franchise, all of the files for the CCG have been lost over time. I've been told it's hypothetically possible that some ancient laptop with all the files for the Brood on it is still out there, waiting to be rediscovered, having miraculously avoided destruction or technical failure or hard disk erasure. If it is out there, and the files are uncorrupted and could be converted to a modern file format, then maybe the Brood could live again. After all, several other dead CCGs have been brought back to life. But let's be honest, it's so improbable you might as well ask for world peace and a pony for Christmas. We'll likely never get to experience the Brood for ourselves. A reprint or resurrection of Feudal Lords seems equally unlikely without some sort of unexpected groundswell of support. Maybe if this video inspires thousands of people to check out the game for themselves, we could inundate Brom with emails begging for a Kickstarter to bring the game back from the dead. Please do not inundate Brom with emails. Not unless you really mean it. Fortunately, Dark Age did actually see a revival in the form of a miniatures wargame that was originally made by startup company Dark Age Games, and later taken over by Cool Mini or Not. The miniatures game was not affiliated with Brom or Peter Schmidt. Dark Age Games merely licensed the rights to the Dark Age brand with associated names and artwork. If you were a hardcore Dark Age CCG fan, it was really cool to see some of your favorite characters brought to life as miniatures, even if they did get some of the names wrong. However, it was also kind of disappointing as nearly the entire story would be changed. Granted, the CCG didn't have much of a story, but it did have one. The minis game did not take place on post-apocalyptic Earth, but instead on a distant planet called Samaria, which was left to fend for itself after the human space empire it relied on moved into a steep decline. Samaria broke down into factional warfare, and then was invaded by multiple alien races. Many of the factions and unique characters from the CCG show up, but again the lore has changed. Cool Mini or Not stopped supporting the game a few years ago and allowed the rights to lapse. On the one hand, this makes getting miniatures for the game more difficult, as it's almost entirely a second-hand market. On the other hand, if you want to make your own minis or role-playing game using the Dark Age brand, the rights are still available for licensing as of the time I write this script. Dark Age really was something else, in a good way. As a game, it was two great tastes that many thought tasted great together. As a collectible item, it has some of the best, most hauntingly beautiful art ever put to card. As an economic endeavor, it was unlucky, unknowingly trapped on a sinking ship, and released at a time when new CCGs were having trouble getting noticed. In another timeline, it could have been a huge success. The forces beyond its control ensured it never really had that chance. Perhaps the lesson here is the depressing truth that you can make all the right decisions and still lose. But let's make some lemonade out of these lemons, because what's important is not letting the failures get you down. Yes, it's sad what happened at Dark Age, but Braun, Peter Schmidt, and I assume the rest of their team all managed to continue on with successful careers. They learned what they could from failure and turned it to their advantage.
Never give up, never surrender.
We'd like to thank you for attending this tour of Dark Age Feudal Lords, and we hope you'll come back for more tours. Again, we're still new at this whole video production thing, so please feel free to leave any suggestions or comments you have so that we can improve. If you enjoy what you've been seeing and would like to help us record the history of CCGs, feel free to contact us. We're a tiny operation and would be happy to meet industry insiders or receive donations. Once again, have fun out there, and always remember to cut the deck.